ever come across like an ancient Greek crossword puzzle?
It's a thing. It is, believe it or not.
I know, right?
So
sounds a little crazy when you put it like that. But it got me thinking, how accessible is ancient Greek, really? I mean, you hear about the influence and everything, but how much does it like really connect with us today?
it's a great question, and it's definitely a lot more than just, borrowing a few words here and there. To really grasp it, we got to understand that ancient Greek, well, it wasn't static. It was a living, breathing language with its own history, dialects, all of that, and it changed over time.
Like a, what's the word? Like a linguistic tapestry,
Yeah.
with all these different regions weaving in their own patterns and stuff. And we actually have some amazing research on this, like really diving deep into how ancient Greek worked. Did you know that it actually covers several like really distinct periods?
Oh, absolutely. And each period has its own distinct, you could say, flavor. We start with Mycenaean Greek, way back, like 1400 to 1200 BC. This is the language of those clay tablets they've dug up, Gives us these little glimpses into a world, well, even before Homer.
Right, ancient history, right?
Right.
And this is where things get a bit like a puzzle, right? Because we don't have a ton of like full texts from this era.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like you're trying to understand a conversation, but all you have are these tiny snippets of phrases. So fascinating for sure, but it's challenging.
Yeah.
Then we move into what they call the Dark Ages from about 1200 to 800 BC. And just to be clear, we're not talking, knights and castles here.
Thankfully, no Black Plague either.
Right.
But if I'm remembering right, this whole Dark Ages thing, it's more about like a lack of written records than a total societal collapse.
Exactly.
It's kind of like how, like, we don't have every tweet from 2012, but that doesn't mean nothing happened that year.
Right. Perfect analogy. But then from there, things get really, really exciting as we hit the Archaic period, around 800 to 500 BC. This is where we meet the big names like Homer, writing those epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
And knowing our listeners, they probably got a copy or two or three on their bookshelf right now.
Right, of course.
But what's so interesting is that Homer's Greek, it wasn't the same as, say, what Plato was using a couple centuries later, right?
You're right, it wasn't. It had this unique character to it, Think of it this way. You time travel to Shakespeare's England, right?
Yeah.
You'd probably, understand the main idea of what they were saying. But I guarantee some of the words, some of the phrases, they'd seem really, really strange.
Yeah, I think that whole thee and thou situation.
Exactly.
Okay, so how did Homer's Greek actually differ from what came later?
Well, one big thing is that his language is just, well, it's rich, full of these archaic words, these poetic expressions, almost like a literary dialect, specifically made to like transport you to this whole world of like gods and heroes.
I like that.
By the classical period, the language, it had become, well, more streamlined, you could say, especially in Athens.
And this is where Athenian Greek gets really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just about the words they were using, but why this particular dialect, rose to the top, right? It wasn't the only one, was it?
No, not at all. Ancient Greece was, incredibly diverse, linguistically speaking. I mean, you had major dialect groups like Ionic, Doric, Aeolic, or Cadocypriot, each one with its own distinct, flavor. Imagine a map of ancient Greece, but instead of just city-states, it's this patchwork of all these different ways of speaking.
Like regional accents, but with like centuries and centuries of history behind them, right?
Exactly, yeah.
We even have a map of this in the research, and it really shows you how spread out these dialects were. So how did Athenian Greek become the star of the show,
Okay, so several factors at play here. First off, Athens, it was a powerhouse, powerful city-state. And its influence, it spread everywhere through trade, through politics, and of course through its just incredible literary output. Think about the impact of Athenian playwrights like Sophocles, Euripides. Their works, they were performed throughout the entire Greek world.
So it wasn't just about like military might, but cultural influence too.
Yeah.
Athenian Greek, it became like the language of philosophy, of drama, of like deep intellectual discussion.
Exactly. And as Athens rose in prominence, its dialect, it naturally just gained more and more prestige. It became the language of, educated people, much like how certain languages today, they hold a certain, it's the word cachet maybe.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's like how everyone wants to learn French, for its elegance, even if they don't live in France. But before Athenian Greek took the lead, imagine the scene, right? You've got all these different regions, each with their own dialect. How do historians even begin to untangle that linguistic web?
It's a fascinating process, really. One of the biggest things they look at is this thing called the Dorian invasion. Happened sometime around the 12th century BC.
Invasion, huh? Okay, things are about to get epic.
Well, maybe not a full-on invasion like in the traditional sense. It was more of a migration of people, you could say, the Dorians who moved southward. And of course, they brought their language and their culture with them.
So instead of armies clashing, we're talking about languages kind of mingling, right?
Exactly. And while we don't have, written records from that exact time, we can see the impact of this migration in the later dialects. It's like putting together one of those jigsaw puzzles, using linguistic clues, archaeological evidence to try and understand how this big movement of people reshaped the linguistic landscape.
Okay, so we've got Athenian Greek on the rise, we've got the Dorian invasion shaking things up centuries earlier, and all these other dialects swirling around. Man, it makes you wonder, what would it have been like to just, I don't know, walk down the street in ancient Greece? You'd be hearing this symphony of different sounds, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of sounds, this is where things get really, really fascinating, because as languages evolve, so do the actual sounds that make them up. And ancient Greek it's a prime example of this. Imagine actually going back in time and hearing those ancient Greeks talking.
Yeah.
You might be in for a surprise. I mean, those sounds, they would have been pretty different to our modern ears.
Right, like how we watch old movies and those old accents make us chuckle a bit.
Yeah.
But with ancient Greek, we're talking about sounds changing over, right, literally centuries.
Yeah.
So how did those changes actually work? Was there any rhyme or reason to it, or was it just sounds changing randomly?
Oh, there were definitely patterns, yeah. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It wasn't just random sounds changing for no reason. Linguists, they've actually traced these shifts back to this ancestor of a whole bunch of languages, including Greek, called Proto-Indo-European.
Okay, so we're going way, way back in time here.
Way back.
So what kind of sonic shenanigans were going on back then?
Well, one major change was how certain consonants they were pronounced. For example, a word that started with an S in Proto-Indo-European, that often it kind of morphed into an H sound in ancient Greek.
So a word that started with a sharper S sound, it softened to more of a breathy H. Got any examples of that linguistic magic trick?
Sure. Take the Latin word sex, right?
Yeah.
It became six in English.
Okay.
In ancient Greek, it becomes hex, pronounced with that H at the
So it's
beginning.
like a big family reunion, but for languages, right? You uncover these these hidden connections between words that seem worlds apart. So cool.
It is cool, yeah.
Were there any other big sound changes that really shook things up?
One of the biggest ones involved a sound. Well, we don't even have it in English anymore. The W sound.
Okay.
Like the one at the start of water.
Right.
Now, this W sound, it was around in the early forms of Greek, but eventually it vanished in a lot of the dialects, including, the famous Attic Greek.
So words just ditched their W. It sounds like an old coat they didn't need anymore.
Exactly. The word work, for example, it would have been pronounced with that W in, say, early Doric Greek. But then it transformed into ergon in Attic Greek, completely lost that initial W.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing.
Yeah.
Right? This happened all over the place.
Well, yeah. It's like a linguistic domino effect.
Yeah.
And this whole W situation, that's just one example. Another fascinating change, it happened to these sounds that linguists, they call them labiovelars.
Labiovelars.
I know, it's a mouthful, right? But stick with me here. So imagine you're using both your lips and the back of your tongue to make a single sound.
Okay, I can barely touch my nose with my tongue, so that sounds tricky.
Right.
But these sounds, over time, they got simpler.
You got it. They did. These labiovelars, they changed into more familiar consonants, like P or T in Attic Greek. For example, that Proto-Indo-European word for where, it might have been pronounced something like ku.
Cool. Yeah, I can see why they simplified it. So how did it end up in Attic Greek?
It became the much simpler pu.
From who to poo? Wow. It's amazing how much sounds can morph over time,
It is.
Makes you wonder what our language will sound like centuries from now.
That is a fascinating thought. But I think the main takeaway here is that these changes, they weren't random, right? They followed these patterns, these rules. And linguists, they've worked so hard to uncover these rules, comparing all these different languages, tracing their evolution. It's like they're putting together this giant linguistic jigsaw puzzle.
And the pieces of this puzzle, they're like scattered across like different languages, different time periods, the whole thing.
Exactly.
But speaking of connections, I can't help but think about all those words, that we use in English that have like Greek origins. It's like ancient Greek is like hiding in plain sight all around us.
It's true. And it's not even just, those technical terms in science or medicine, although there are plenty of those for sure. Greek words, they've found their way into our like everyday vocabulary in some pretty cool ways.
Oh, I love a good linguistic treasure hunt. So what kind of words are we talking about here?
Think about the word telephone comes from the Greek words tele, meaning far, and phone, meaning sound. So essentially it's a device for far sound, which, not a bad description for something invented thousands of years later.
I mean,
right?
It's like those ancient words were like waiting for the right technology to like catch up with them. But it's not just like everyday objects, is it?
No, not at all. Not at all. What about the word democracy itself? It's from demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule.
Rule of the people,
Uh-huh.
a concept that started in ancient Greece and, well, it's still shaping the world today, right?
Absolutely.
Although the way we do democracy now, it's probably a lot different from, how the ancient Greeks imagined it.
Oh, that's a really good point. When we, really dig into what democracy meant back then in its historical context, it had some different, what's the word, connotations than our modern understanding. For example, Athenian democracy, it was a direct democracy. Citizens, they actually participated directly in government.
Right, a big difference from our representative democracies where, we vote for people to make decisions for us.
Exactly. And this difference, it just goes to show how a word's meaning, it can change over time right alongside the actual concepts it represents.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that we can't just, slap our modern understanding onto these ancient terms.
Right. It's like trying to read an ancient text with a 21st century dictionary you might miss, like the deeper meaning, right?
Precisely.
But this connection between like ancient Greek and all these modern ideas, it goes way beyond just politics, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we see it in science, in art, in philosophy, you name it.
It's everywhere. And it's all a testament to the enduring legacy of ancient Greek thought, and its impact on Western civilization as a whole. And it's not even just about like individual words. It's about the whole way Greeks approached knowledge, how they try to understand the world.
So their language, it reflects a certain way of thinking, a way of seeing the world that's just resonated through the ages.
Exactly. Yeah. And that brings us to another really cool way that ancient Greek has influenced us, its impact on how we like name and categorize the natural world.
So we're not just talking telephone and democracy here. Ancient Greek, it's like dinosaur naming level stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, even with creatures that lived, millions of years ago, we still see those ancient Greek roots in their names. Carl Linnaeus, he's the father of taxonomy. He leaned heavily on Greek and Latin when he was creating that whole system for classifying species.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, those scientific names can sound like seriously ancient sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's got to be more than just like trying to sound impressive, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. It's about creating this like common language for knowledge, a way to connect different cultures, different time periods, all through the shared like vocabulary of science. And it gives us this really interesting window into how the ancient Greeks, how they looked at the world, how they categorized everything around them.
So give me an example. What's a word that really shows that Greek connection to nature?
Okay, take the word hippopotamus. It literally translates to, get this, river horse.
No way.
From the Greek hippos for horse and potamos for river.
It's like you go to the zoo and you're getting a mini etymology lesson at the same time. I'm like, starting to see ancient Greek everywhere now.
Right. It's everywhere.
It's wild.
And it's truly remarkable. I mean, these words coined centuries ago, and we're still using them today, to describe like all the diversity of life on Earth. And it's It's bigger than just individual species, too. Even those big categories, the ones we use to group organisms together, they often have Greek origins, like Arthropoda. That's the
Hmm.
phylum that includes, insects, spiders, crustaceans.
Okay.
That comes from arthron, which means joint, and pois, which means foot.
So jointed feet, which, yeah, when you think about how those creatures move, it makes total sense.
Exactly.
It's like the names themselves, they like unlock this whole deeper understanding of the natural world.
They do, and it highlights how the Greeks they recognize those patterns, those relationships in nature, and that's like a fundamental principle of scientific thought, you know?
It's amazing to think that by learning even a little bit of ancient Greek, we're not just like decoding words, but we're connecting with this whole way of thinking, this way of seeing the world that's been so incredibly influential for centuries.
It's true.
And that kind of brings us full circle back to that idea of ancient Greek crosswords. It's
Oh,
like
right.
it's the perfect example of making this ancient language relevant to how we learn today, you know.
Absolutely. It challenges us to really engage with the language, but in this fun, accessible way. So instead of just memorizing vocabulary lists, you're searching for those connections, you're unraveling clues, and you're discovering how those ancient words, they still have meaning for us, even now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a mental workout, but disguised as a game. And who knows, maybe solving those clues will like inspire people to dive even deeper into ancient Greek literature, history, all of it, right?
Precisely. It opens up so many possibilities.
This deep dive has been, wow, incredible. We talked about the evolution of sounds, the influence on English, the connection to the natural world. It's like we're uncovering these hidden layers of meaning like everywhere.
It's true. And it just goes to show ancient Greek, it's far from a dead language. It's this living thread,
Yeah.
woven into the tapestry of human history, of knowledge, and it's still shaping how we communicate, how we think, how we understand the world, even today.
Hey, who knows? Maybe we'll all be like tackling ancient Greek crosswords in our free time, right? It's definitely given me this whole new perspective on the power of this language and how its legacy, it really does, it endures. So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this, what if we approach learning anything new, anything, with that same sense of play, that curiosity, that a crossword puzzle, it sparks in us. What hidden connections, what aha moments could we find?
Yeah.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.